This set of notes is on ratios, rates, and proportions. The objective is to recognize proportional relationships and to solve problems involving rates and ratios. Let's establish some common vocabulary. A ratio is a comparison of two quantities with the same units. The comparison can be written using the word to, a colon, or it can be written as a fraction. A rate is a comparison of two quantities as well, but with different units. For example, miles per hour or heartbeats per minute. Last, a proportion is a pair of equivalent ratios or rates. You will typically see a proportion represented as a fraction equals a fraction. For example, 4/9 equals 8/18 is a proportion. When two fractions are equivalent, they will have the same cross products. Here, 8 times 9 is 72, and 4 times 18 is 72. The previous example of a proportion did not contain any variables. Let's look at how to solve a proportion with an unknown quantity. For every 4 apples that Matthew eats, he eats 9 bags of popcorn. If in 1 week Matthew has eaten 8 apples, how many bags of popcorn has he eaten? Let's set up a proportion based on the information they have given us. In doing so, it is imperative that you line up your units uniformly. It tells us that for every 4 apples he eats 9 bags of popcorn. We can write this as a rate of 4/9. Notice that my apples are on top of my fraction and that the popcorn is on the bottom. This means that when I write my second fraction, I have to have apples on top and popcorn on the bottom. Therefore, since we also know that Matthew has eaten 8 apples, that will be the numerator of the second fraction. Since we don't know how many bags of popcorn he has eaten, we will put an x in the denominator of the second fraction. Now, let's use what you already know about cross products. They are going to be equal. So, 8 times 9 equals 4 times x, giving us 72 equals 4x. Next, solve for x by dividing both sides by 4. This gives us that 18 equals x. So, Matthew ate 18 bags of popcorn. A boat can travel 128 miles on 8 gallons of fuel. How many gallons of fuel will be needed to go 384 miles? First, set up the first fraction based on the fact that we know the boat can travel 128 miles on 8 gallons. We can write the rate 128/8. Remember that you put miles on top and gallons on the bottom. So we need to be sure that we set up the second fraction with the same units. We want to know gallons needed for 384 miles. In lining up our units correctly, the second fraction will be 384/x. Now, because this is a proportion, these two fractions are equal, and we also know that their cross products will be equal. 384 times 8 equals 128 times x. So 3072 equals 128x. In order to isolate the variable, we have to divide both sides by 128. This gives us 24 equals x. Therefore, the boat will need 24 gallons of fuel. If it takes 18 pounds of fertilizer to cover 54 acres, how much land can be covered with 42 pounds of fertilizer? Set up your first fraction as 18 pounds over 54 acres. Remember that that is pounds over acres. Now, finish setting up your proportion with the second fraction, 42 pounds over x acres. Take note that my units are uniform. Pounds are in the numerator and acres are in the denominator. Now, find the cross products. 42 times 54 and 18 times x. This gives us the equation 2,268 equals 18x. To isolate the variable, we need to divide both sides by 18, giving us 126 equals x. Therefore, 42 pounds of fertilizer will cover 126 acres. We can even solve proportions with more than one unknown. Use the fact that you know the cross products are equal, and we know that negative 40 times x equals negative 24 times the binomial x minus 4. Be sure that you distribute the negative 24 to each term of the binomial. Giving us negative 24 plus 96 equals negative 40x. Now, we need to get all our variables onto one side, so we need to add 24x to both sides. This gives us that 96 equals negative 16x. Next, divide both sides by negative 16 to isolate the variable, and we end up with negative 6 equals x. Let's try one more with multiple appearances of the variable. Our proportion is 5 over 2x equals 10 over the binomial x minus 6. Now, find the cross products. 2x times 10 and 5 times the binomial x minus 6. This gives us the equation 20x equals 5 times the binomial x minus 6. Now, remember that you need to distribute the 5 to the binomial x minus 6. This results in 20x equals 5x minus 30. Get all the variables on one side by subtracting 5x from both sides. And we now have 15x equals negative 30. Divide both sides by 15 to isolate the variable, and we get that x equals negative 2. In conclusion, we ask ourselves, how are proportions similar to fractions? Remember that a proportion is a set of equivalent fractions. What is the difference between a ratio and a rate? While ratios and rates are very similar, the difference between the two is that ratios have the same units and rates have different units.